I thought she simply hadn't seen me. That was my first instinct, the generous maternal reflex that had kept me warm and blind for nearly 3 years. I was standing on the corner of Birchwood and Fifth, soaking through my coat, my canvas grocery bags digging red welts into both palms, and I watched my daughter's silver Honda slow almost to a stop at the light, not 10 feet from where I stood. The rain was hammering the sidewalk in solid gray sheets, bouncing off the asphalt like something angry. I waved. She looked directly at me through the windshield. I saw her eyes, dark and focused, saw the recognition move across her face like a shadow passing. And then the light turned green, and she drove away. She didn't slow down. She didn't roll down the window. She did not stop. 3 days later, when I finally said something, standing in her kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold between my hands, she looked up from her phone with an expression of mild impatience and said, "Mom, I was late for a meeting. You could have taken the bus." It was the way she said it, bored, slightly clipped, the way you speak to someone who keeps raising an issue that was resolved long ago, that finally made something shift inside me, something tectonic and irreversible. And it was what I found that same evening in the kitchen drawer underneath the takeout menus and a tangle of old rubber bands that turned that quiet shift into an earthquake. My name is Anna. I am 58 years old, and until 14 months ago, I had a life that felt, if not spectacular, then genuinely good. Solid and clean, and built entirely with my own hands over decades of careful, unglamorous effort. I spent 26 years as a registered nurse at Mercy General. The night shifts, the double shifts, the Christmases spent eating vending machine sandwiches in fluorescent corridors, while other people opened presents and carved turkeys. And when I finally retired, I owned my house free and clear. No mortgage, no debt. No one to answer to. Just a small, cream-colored house on a quiet street in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, with a deep front porch where I like to sit in the evenings with a glass of iced tea, listening to the neighborhood settle into itself, and a maple tree in the backyard that turned the color of burning copper every October and lit up the kitchen window, like a stained glass window in a church I had never quite believed in, but always found beautiful. That house was not just a building. It was the physical proof that I had done something right, that the years of 12-hour shifts and packed lunches and secondhand furniture and saying no to things I wanted so I could say yes to things Claire needed had added up to something real and permanent. Something that could not be taken back. I had raised Claire in that house, alone, from the time she was 9 years old, and her father, Graham, walked out to start a second life with a woman he'd met at a pharmaceutical conference in Phoenix. He left on a Tuesday in November with 2 suitcases and a very brief conversation at the kitchen table. And that was that. I had sat with that for about 2 weeks. Sitting with it meaning mostly not sleeping and not eating and going to work anyway, because people needed their medications at 3 a.m. regardless of what was happening in my personal life. And then I had gotten up and painted the bedroom a warm shade of butter yellow, and I had decided that the house was mine and Claire's, and that we were going to be fine. We were fine. More than fine, on most days. I painted every room in that house myself over the years, changing the colors as we changed, as the light changed, as the seasons taught me something new about what I needed to see when I walked in from a long shift. I replaced the kitchen tiles one summer, watching YouTube tutorials on my laptop at midnight because I could not afford a contractor, and I refused to live with cracked grout for another season. I planted rose bushes along the front fence the spring Claire graduated high school. 1 bush for every year of her life, 18 roses in shades of cream and coral and deep red. And every May since then, when they bloomed, I stood on the porch in the morning with my coffee and breathed in that smell and felt like I had done at least one thing in my life that was unambiguously right. The smell of those roses, warm and dense and faintly spiced, like something ancient and reliable. I still remember it exactly. I think I always will. Claire moved back to Columbus when she was 29, after her first serious relationship ended badly in Chicago. She arrived with a rented van, 8 boxes, and a carefully maintained composure that I recognized immediately as the face she wore when she was more hurt than she intended to let on. She had my jaw and her father's stubbornness and her own particular brand of pride that had always made it difficult for her to admit when something had defeated her. I did not push. I made up the guest room with the yellow curtains, and I stocked the refrigerator with the things I knew she liked. Oat milk, those expensive rosemary crackers, the specific brand of Greek yogurt she'd eaten since her sophomore year of college. And I told her she could stay as long as she needed to, and I meant it completely. The house felt alive again in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. She had a new boyfriend, Derek. He drove a leased BMW he spoke about with the reverence most people reserved for living things. And he had a handshake that was half a second too firm and a habit of finishing other people's sentences in a way that felt less like agreement and more like correction. He was 34, worked at a real estate investment firm downtown. Acquisitions analyst, he always said, with the specific gravity of a man who expected you to be impressed by titles. And he dressed in the kind of clothes that suggested he had consulted a guide called How to Look Successful While Appearing Effortless. I did not particularly like him, but I have been a nurse for 26 years, which means I have spent my entire adult life being professionally kind to people I did not particularly like, and I was very good at it. I smiled warmly. I learned how he took his coffee. I made room for his presence in my house the way you make room for a piece of furniture that doesn't quite fit, by rearranging everything else and pretending it was always supposed to be that way. Derek moved into Claire's room 6 months after she arrived. I told myself I didn't mind, and for the most part, I believed it. They were adults. They were happy. Claire laughed differently around him, sharper, quicker, more confident, and I told myself that was a good sign, that she had healed from whatever Chicago had done to her, that she was building something real. We developed a rhythm, the 3 of us, in the way that people who share a space develop rhythms whether they intend to or not. Sunday dinners at my house. I cooked, because cooking was one of the ways I knew how to love, the most direct and least complicated way I had ever found. Tuesday phone calls with Claire, Derek and I maintaining the kind of careful, cordial distance that 2 people maintain when they have silently agreed that close inspection of the other would not serve either of them. The questions started small. That is how I remember it now. Small and spaced, carefully apart, each one isolated enough to seem reasonable in the moment, each one only forming a pattern in retrospect, when I finally allowed myself to look back and see the shape of what had been happening. The first came in October, about 18 months after Claire had moved back. One of those cool Sunday evenings when the kitchen smelled of roasting chicken and garlic, and the last of the day's light came in low and amber through the window above the sink, turning the steam from the roasting pan into something almost luminous. Derek was at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, turning it slowly by the stem, watching me with that calm, assessing attention he sometimes turned on things he was considering purchasing. Claire was setting the table in the dining room. I could hear the soft, familiar clink of silverware. Derek said, without looking up, in a tone so casual it barely registered, "Anna, do you have the house in a trust, or is it still just in your name?" I turned from the stove. "Just in my name," I said. "Why?" He shrugged, a small, practiced shrug. "Oh, no reason. Just thinking about estate planning. It's smart to think ahead. When people get to a certain age, these things can get complicated if they're not set up properly." I turned back to the chicken. I told myself it was reasonable. He worked in real estate. These were things people in real estate thought about. I told myself this several times that evening, and again later, lying in bed with the maple tree tapping softly against the window, and eventually I believed it enough to fall asleep. The second question came in January, on a gray weekday afternoon. Claire arrived unannounced, which was unusual, still wearing her coat, as though she hadn't planned to stay long. She'd made tea without asking, something she had done since she was a teenager, reaching for the familiar comfort of our kitchen as though it were an extension of herself, and she sat down at the table and folded her hands and said she had been thinking about emergency planning. She said it the way you say something you have rehearsed, measured, reasonable, preemptively calm. Derek's mother had done it, she explained, set up a joint bank account with her children so that if there was a medical emergency, if something happened suddenly, the family could access funds to help. "Just a precaution, Mom. We wouldn't touch it otherwise. It's just so that if you fell or if there was some kind of crisis, we could actually do something instead of being stuck waiting for courts and paperwork." I looked at her across the table. She met my eyes easily, steadily, with a smile I had known for 32 years. That particular smile, warm on the surface, very still underneath. The smile she had used since childhood, when she had already decided how a conversation was going to end and was simply managing the route. I told her I would think about it. She said that was fine, no rush, finished her tea, and left. And I stood at the window and watched her car pull away through the gray afternoon and felt something cold and formless move through me, something I refused to name. I told myself, "She's your daughter. She loves you. You are being paranoid. You are a 57-year-old woman who lives alone and is not sleeping well and reads too many news articles about scams. You are projecting. Stop it." But the questions didn't stop. In March, Claire mentioned almost in passing that houses in my neighborhood were selling fast. "Yours would probably go for $350, maybe $375 right now, Mom. Can you even believe that?" She said it brightly, admiringly, watching my face with that same quiet attention that I was starting to notice and starting to distrust. In April, she asked whether I'd had my will reviewed recently, and when I said my will was perfectly fine, she tilted her head and said that laws changed, that it was worth having a qualified attorney look at it. She knew someone Derek trusted completely, very experienced in estate planning. In May, Derek spent 40 minutes at Sunday dinner describing an independent living community he'd seen profiled in a local magazine, somewhere outside Dayton, talking about it with a warmth and enthusiasm that felt slightly rehearsed. "It's nothing like the old nursing homes, Anna. These are genuinely beautiful, more like resorts, with full activities, programs, and on-site medical staff and everything," while Claire refilled my wine glass without being asked, and the candles guttered slightly in a draft from the window and nobody quite looked at me. By June, I was sleeping poorly. I would lie in my bed, the same bed I had slept in for 20 years, in the room at the back of the house with the window that looked out on the maple tree, and I would stare at the ceiling and turn the questions over in my mind like stones, looking for what was underneath them. But every time I came close to naming what I was afraid of, I stopped myself. Because naming it meant believing something about my own daughter that I was not prepared to believe. I was not ready to stand in the rubble of that. So I didn't. I kept making Sunday dinners. I kept watering the roses. I told myself I was imagining things. The rain came on a Tuesday in late September. I had walked to the grocery store on 5th because my car was in the shop, a minor repair, a belt replacement, and by the time I came out with my bags, the sky had opened into a cold, relentless downpour. I started walking. I was 3 blocks from home when I saw the silver Honda Civic with the dent in the rear bumper from where Claire had backed into a parking meter on her second week back in Columbus. I would know that car anywhere. I raised both arms. The light turned green. She drove away. That evening, I stood in my kitchen and dripped onto the floor and felt something I could not name settle over me like a physical weight. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder and more exact. The particular feeling of understanding, at last, a sentence you have been hearing wrong for years. I dried off. I made tea. And then, because I had found a takeout menu on the counter and I was returning it to the drawer where I kept such things, I opened the kitchen drawer, the deep one on the left, the one that collected the comfortable miscellany of a life lived in one place. Takeout menus and rubber bands and spare batteries and a birthday candle shaped like a 7 that had been there since Claire's last birthday dinner, because I kept thinking I should throw it away and never did. And underneath all of it, pushed to the very back of the drawer as though someone had placed it there carefully, hoping it would stay hidden, I found a manila folder. My hand did not tremble when I picked it up. That surprised me later. I remember thinking that my hands should have been shaking, but they were perfectly steady, the way your hands are sometimes steady in the worst moments of your life, when your body has understood something before your mind has allowed itself to catch up. I set it on the counter. I opened it. And then the floor moved. Inside the folder, there were 3 documents. I took them out one by one, slowly, the way you handle something you sense is dangerous before you understand why, with that primitive body-level caution that bypasses thought entirely. The first was a durable power of attorney, printed on heavy cream-colored paper with the name of a law firm I had never heard of in the letterhead. The document was dated 11 months ago. It named Claire Marie Holloway as my attorney-in-fact, granting her the authority to manage my financial accounts, execute transactions, and I had to read this sentence 3 times before the words assembled themselves into a meaning I could hold: to sell, transfer, or otherwise dispose of real property owned by the principal. The principal. That was me. I was the principal. I stared at that word for a long moment. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the rain was still coming down in patient, relentless sheets. I was the principal, and according to this document, I had signed it on the 14th of November, on a Wednesday, at the offices of Harlan and Booth, attorneys at law with my full signature. Anna Ruth Holloway, in blue ink at the bottom of the second page. I had not been to the offices of Harlan and Booth on the 14th of November. I had not been to any attorney's office in over 4 years. I knew my own handwriting. 26 years of nursing notes, 26 years of initialing medications and signing charts in the compressed, looping script that my supervising nurse had told me in 1995 looked like a seismograph during a mild earthquake. And the signature at the bottom of that page was close, very close, almost convincing. But it was not mine. The loop on the capital A was wrong. The way the H crossed into the O was wrong. The pressure on the second L was wrong. It was a good forgery. It was not a perfect one. I set it down on the counter and picked up the second document with hands that were now, finally, beginning to tremble. The second document was a listing agreement. It was from Pinnacle Realty Group, and it was addressed to Claire Holloway as the authorized agent for the property at 412 Birchwood Lane, Columbus, Ohio. My address, my house. The asking price was listed as $360,000. The listing was dated 3 weeks ago. It had not been filled out entirely. The final closing date line was blank. But the preliminary commission structure had been agreed, and there was Claire's signature on the agent authorization line, neat and confident, and below it, in the space marked Authorized Representative of Owner, the same forged version of my name, executed in what I now recognized as the same hand. The third document was a brochure, Maple Ridge Independent Living and Memory Care Community, Westerville, Ohio. It had been folded carefully in thirds, and someone, I would think about the casualness of this gesture for months afterward, the sheer ordinary quality of it, had used a yellow highlighter to mark a specific line in the residency options section. Studio suite, all-inclusive monthly fee, $3,200. Financial assistance available through property equity transfer. Someone had also circled in blue pen the phone number at the bottom of the brochure. The circle was clean and deliberate, the mark of someone who had already made up their mind. I stood at the kitchen counter for what felt like a very long time, though the clock later told me it was less than 8 minutes. The rain tapped at the window above the sink. The neighbor's dog barked twice and was silent. I was aware of the cold water still drying in my hair, of the clammy weight of my coat still draped over the kitchen chair where I'd dropped it, of the faint smell of chicken stock from a pot I'd left soaking in the sink. All of these ordinary domestic details arranged themselves with terrible clarity around the thing I was holding in my hands. The plan was not complicated, and it was not new, and it had been running quietly in the background of my life for at least a year, perhaps longer, while I made Sunday dinners and watered roses and told myself I was imagining things. The plan was to establish legal authority over my assets through a document I had never signed. Sell the house. Use the proceeds to fund my placement in a care facility I had never visited and had not chosen. And whatever remained, after fees and residency costs, and the real estate commission, and the attorney's fees for Harlan and Booth, would go where? Into whose hands exactly? I knew the answer. I had known it in the part of myself I had been refusing to listen to for months. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I did not plan to do this. My knees simply decided, without consulting the rest of me, that they were no longer willing to hold me upright. I sat on the cold tiles with the 3 documents in my lap, and I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, and I said out loud into the empty kitchen, she was going to take the house. Not a question, a statement of fact absorbing its own weight. Then, after a long moment of nothing but rain and the refrigerator and the clock, Derek. Because this was Derek's architecture. This had Derek's fingerprints all over it. The research, the law firm, the forged signatures, the brochure with the highlighted line and the circled phone number. Derek, who worked in acquisitions. Derek, who had asked about the trust structure with such practiced casualness while turning his wine glass by the stem. Derek, who had spent 40 minutes describing Maple Ridge as though it were a resort, while Claire refilled my wine glass and the candles guttered. Derek had built this plan and Claire had let him, and possibly, I forced myself to finish the thought, possibly Claire had not needed much persuading. I got up off the floor. That was the moment. I would recognize it later as the exact moment the thing that had always made me a good nurse. The capacity to set aside what you feel and focus with absolute precision on what needs to be done, arrived and took over. I dried my face with a dish towel. I put the 3 documents back in the folder. I went to the bedroom and I sat on the edge of the bed and I called my friend Rosemary, who had been my charge nurse for 11 years at Mercy General, and who was, among other things, the most practically intelligent person I had ever known. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I had found. She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. I counted, and then she said, "Don't call Claire tonight. Don't touch those documents again without gloves, and call Ellen Marcus first thing in the morning." Ellen Marcus was an elder law attorney whose name I had heard Rosemary mention twice over the years, once admiringly, once in connection with a case against an abusive nursing home. "She's very good," Rosemary said. "She's also very expensive, and she will be completely worth it. Don't say a word to Claire or Derek before you've talked to Ellen. Not one word." I wrote the name down on the notepad I kept by the phone. My handwriting was perfectly steady. I noticed that. I thought, there it is. My signature, my actual signature, the one I know from the inside. I thought, I know exactly what I signed and what I did not sign, and no one is going to tell me otherwise. I called Ellen Marcus the next morning at 9 o'clock. I had not slept. I had sat in the kitchen until 2 in the morning, drinking tea and constructing, methodically, a timeline. Every question, every conversation, every Sunday dinner with its carefully rehearsed remarks about care facilities and property values and estate planning. I had taken photographs of all 3 documents with my phone before placing them in a sealed envelope, which I locked in the metal box where I kept my actual will, my actual deed, my actual financial records. By the time I dialed Ellen's office, I had the timeline on paper, the photographs backed up to 2 different cloud accounts, and a composure that felt less like calm and more like the very still water at the center of something moving very fast. Ellen's assistant put me through within 20 minutes. Ellen listened without interrupting while I described what I had found. When I finished, she said, "Come in today at 2. Bring everything. Don't cancel any plans with Claire. Behave exactly as normal until we've spoken." I met with Ellen Marcus for 2 hours that afternoon in an office that smelled of good coffee and old paper and something faintly floral, a small vase of white freesia on the corner of her desk. She was in her early 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the particular unhurried attention of someone who had heard many terrible things and understood that the appropriate response to each of them was careful, methodical precision rather than noise. She examined the forged POA. She examined the listing agreement. She set the Maple Ridge brochure aside with a small controlled expression that suggested it was not the first time she had seen one used as a planning tool by the wrong people. She asked me a series of careful questions about Derek's professional background and whether I had ever given any verbal consent to any property discussion or financial arrangement. Then she told me, calmly and without theatrical emphasis, what she was going to do. The following Sunday, I made pot roast. I set the table with the good plates. I lit the candles. I made sure the roses, the last of the fall ones, 2 deep red blooms that had opened improbably late in October, were in the vase on the sideboard. Claire arrived at 6 with Derek, who was wearing a new jacket the color of wet slate and carrying a bottle of wine he set on the counter with the air of a man who is used to his gifts being recognized as such. Everything was exactly as it had always been. I was warm and easy, and I made them both feel entirely comfortable, because I had spent 26 years making people comfortable in circumstances far more frightening than a Sunday dinner, and I was very, very good at it. I asked Derek about work. I asked Claire about the women's conference she'd attended the previous week. I refilled their glasses. I passed the bread. I watched them both relax into the familiarity of the evening, and I thought, you chose the wrong person to underestimate. It was after dessert that I set the folder on the table. Claire reached for her wine glass and stopped. Derek went very still. I watched them look at the folder and then at each other, and in that one glance, brief, reflexive, immediately suppressed, I saw everything I needed to see. They knew exactly what was in that folder. They had always known it was in the drawer. Someone had put it there. I had asked myself why, turning it over for days, and I had arrived at only one answer. They had wanted me to find it. Not yet, not tonight, not so soon, but eventually. At the right moment, after the house was sold and the paperwork was signed and the process was already in motion, they had intended for me to find it and to understand that it was already too late, that the thing was already done. What they had not anticipated was that I would find it a month ahead of schedule on a rainy Tuesday because I was returning a takeout menu to a kitchen drawer. I think, I said very quietly, we should talk about this. The silence that followed was not empty. It had texture and weight. It pressed against the candle flames and made them waver slightly. Claire set down her wine glass. Derek had still not moved. Claire said in a voice that was careful and low and not quite steady, "Mom, I can explain." "I'd like to hear Derek explain," I said. I did not look at my daughter. I looked at Derek. He held my gaze for 3 seconds and then looked away, and in that small, defeated turn of his head, I saw the whole architecture collapse. He had built this carefully. He had been patient and methodical and clever, and he had made one critical error. He had underestimated me. He had looked at a 57-year-old woman living alone in a house she owned outright and seen an asset with insufficient protection and a daughter who could be persuaded. He had not seen someone who had spent 26 years keeping her own counsel and choosing every single day when to speak and when to be quiet and when to act. "The document is forged," I said. "I have a forensic document analyst reviewing it as of yesterday afternoon. I also have a copy of the listing agreement with Pinnacle Realty, and I've already spoken to the agency's managing broker, who was, let me think of the word, alarmed, when I explained that the authorized representative's signature was fraudulent." I had not slept, but my voice was perfectly level. "My attorney has notified Adult Protective Services, the Ohio State Bar regarding Harlan and Booth, and the Columbus Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, who will be in contact with Derek's employer next week." Claire made a sound. It was a small, broken sound, like something being set down too quickly, and it cracked the composure I had been holding all evening, not destroying it, but bending it. Because she was my daughter. She had the same jaw as me, and she had been 9 years old when her father left on a Tuesday in November, and I had held her for 2 hours that night while she cried, and I had promised her, in the absolute sincerity that only grief permits, that everything was going to be all right. I had meant it then. I meant a different version of it now. "He told me it was legal," Claire said. She was not looking at me. She was looking at her hands, folded in her lap in the way she had sat as a small child when she was confessing something, shoulders slightly forward, chin lowered. "He said it was just a precaution, that we were protecting you. that if something happened to you— Nothing happened to me, I said. Nothing has happened to me. I'm 58 years old and I own my house and I am in perfect health, and someone was preparing to sell it out from under me and use the proceeds to warehouse me in a facility outside Dayton. I let that sentence sit. Then, did you think I would never find out? Or did you think that by the time I did, it would be too late to matter? She didn't answer. Derek stood up from the table. He started to say something. Something composed and managerial. Something that began with, "Anna, I think there has been a serious misunderstanding." And I held up one hand and he stopped. "You are not going to speak in my house again," I said. "You are going to leave it now, and you are going to speak only to attorneys from this point forward." He left. He took his wine. He left so quickly that the front door had not fully closed before his car was starting in the driveway, and the sound of the BMW pulling away in the dark, fast and without its usual studied ease, was the most honest thing I had ever heard from him. Claire and I sat at the table for a long time after he left. The candles burned low. I refilled my own wine glass but did not drink from it. She told me, piece by piece, the way you tell something you have been building the courage to say for a long time, how it had started. Derek had framed it as security planning, as protection, as love, and how it had grown, and how at each stage she had told herself that the next step was still reversible, still controllable, still something that would never quite go as far as she suspected it might. She had not asked whose name was being forged. She had told herself she didn't need to know. The distance between complicity and cowardice, I thought, was a very short walk and a very long one to come back from. She slept in her old room that night, the room with the yellow curtains, and I sat on the porch until midnight with a blanket and my tea, and the smell of the last 2 roses, which the rain had not quite destroyed. I sat in the dark and I felt more than anything the weight of my own exhaustion. Not the tiredness of a bad night, but the accumulated tiredness of years of not trusting what I knew, of talking myself out of my own perception, of being generous toward people who were counting on that generosity as a structural element of their plan. I thought about every question I had dismissed, every Sunday dinner with its rehearsed concerns, every glass of wine refilled at the precise moment I needed to see clearly, and I thought, not again. This is the last time I choose not to see. Derek was let go from Pinnacle's partner firm within 2 weeks, following their own internal review of the listing agreement and a call from Ellen Marcus's office. The attorney at Harlan & Booth, who had notarized the forged signature, a young associate apparently panicked when the bar complaint arrived, cooperated with investigators and confirmed that Derek had presented himself as my authorized representative. The criminal investigation moved slowly, as these things do, but it moved. Claire and I spoke 3 times a week through that winter, always briefly, always carefully. 2 people learning from scratch whether anything true remained between them once the comfortable structure of willful ignorance had been taken away. In February, I had the kitchen drawer replaced. The new one runs smoothly and closes without catching, and I keep it organized now. Take-out menus in front, rubber bands in a small container, a spare key on a hook I installed myself with a drill I bought on sale, and a YouTube tutorial I watched at midnight. No hidden folders. Nothing that needs to be found by accident, because nothing in my house is an accident anymore. On the first warm Sunday in March, the roses along the front fence showed their first tight buds, small, closed, the color of a secret they hadn't yet decided whether to tell. I stood on the porch with my coffee and I breathed in the faint, cold smell of them, all promise and no revelation, and I thought, I built this. I paid for this in years and in nights and in things I gave up and things I held on to when holding on was the harder choice. This is mine. The deed is in my name. The signature is the one I carry in my hand, the one that looks like a seismograph during a mild earthquake, and no one will sign it but me. I took my time with the coffee. I watched the neighborhood come to life in the thin spring light, and then I went inside and I made breakfast for one, and it was, without qualification, enough.